It's a painful day for Kiev resident Stanislav Alexeyevich. 75 years ago, Nazi soldiers packed him into a cattle train car and shipped him off to a Third Reich slave labor camp. He was only 18 when he was transported along with millions of other Ukrainians. In a sickening twist to their ordeal, many of the Ukrainians who survived the Nazi slave labor program and returned to the Soviet Union after World War II were sent to the gulags by the communist authorities. 93-year-old Stanislav still vividly recalls the horrors of his time as a slave in Hitler's Reich. Every day at gunpoint, we were forced to walk 2.5 kilometers to the factory where we would begin working. After more than a year as a slave, I felt I was close to death. There was almost no food, and we had to make do with whatever was available. When the commander of the plant saw that I was no longer able to carry heavy weights, he sent me to a different factory. After 3 months at this new slave camp, I managed to escape. Large-scale deportations of Ukrainians began on January 18, 1942. This is the day when Nazi soldiers sent off more than 1,000 Ukrainians to Cologne in Nazi Germany. Within 2 years, more than 2 million Ukrainians had been sent to the Nazi slave labor camps as Hitler's empire became increasingly dependent on slave labor. Slaves were used in the armaments, manufacturing, agriculture, and automobile industries. Famous brands including BMW and the Ford Motor Company profited from Nazi slave labor. The Blitzkrieg had failed by this point, and the Nazis had suffered catastrophic losses. Germany simply did not have enough people to replace the manpower it was losing, so the Nazi leadership became increasingly reliant on slave labor from Eastern Europe. There were so many young people from Ukraine taken as slaves. When Allied forces and Soviet troops began liberating Nazi concentration camps in 1945, they discovered scenes of horror. The slave labor camps were filled with dead bodies and tens of thousands of terminally ill prisoners. But survivors would have to wait many decades for any semblance of justice. The Nazi slave labor program was a terrible crime against humanity. It is hard to believe such a thing happened in the 20th century. The German government pays financial compensation for Nazi slave laborers, including a large number of Ukrainians. This is still a very painful subject for today's Germans. German society remains very sensitive to the crimes committed by the Nazis across Europe. In 1946, the Nuremberg trial recognized slave labor in Nazi Germany as a crime against humanity. But this did not prevent the Soviet authorities from persecuting Ukrainians who returned from the slave camps alive. Many ended up in Stalin's gulags. In the 1980s, West Germany and the USSR finally began negotiations over financial compensation for victims of the Nazi slave labor camps. However, survivors only began to receive payments following the collapse of the Soviet Union.